Good morning, guys and girls. We're going to continue on with chapter 7 of Romans, lesson 2, from republic to empire. So we're going to look at these conflicts that take place that cause Rome to go from this democracy, this republic, to this dictatorship, and to this empire. We're going to see these different conflicts, and a lot of it has to do with land ownership. And in earlier civilizations that we've studied, we see how land ownership typically plays a role in how the peasants react to the government. We'll see this later on in the later chapters once we get to the French Revolution. And I've been previewing that big time all year long. It's one of my favorite chapters. So let's look first at why the story matters. We're talking about early in the days of the Roman Republic, where farmers were the main reason that Rome was a successful place. As Rome grew, the landed aristocracy, those who owned land and those who owned a lot of land and were rich because of it, they became more and more powerful, and the ideals of the republic changed. So by 129 BC, Rome stood supreme over the Mediterranean Sea. It ruled everything in the Mediterranean area. But the process of creating this empire, it actually weakened the internal stability of Rome. Those who actually ruled it, the Senate, they became weaker and they lost their power to their aristocracy. This led to a series of crises that plagued Rome for over the next 100 years. So we're going to look at vocab words today, keywords, the triumvirate, what a dictator is, and what the word imperator means. We're going to look at these two brothers, the Gracchus brothers, who actually tried to reform Rome, this economic and social crisis that Rome had through land reforms by redistributing the land to those who were not as rich. And then we're going to look at the end of the republic, how we go from having a Senate in control, a democracy in control, to how we end up with our first triumvirate, a second triumvirate, and ultimately an imperator or an emperor. Here's our bell ringer. It's a web diagram on Julius Caesar and some things that he was famous for, or famous people that he was connected to. So this is what's called a web diagram. You have a central hub in the middle with spokes that radiate out into other areas that connect back to the main person or issue topic that we're looking at. So what we want to look at first is what was a famous quote that Julius Caesar said? Well, I've actually heard it said in class already, and a lot of you know this. It was et tu Brute, which is like in YouTube Brutus, and he says this right before he dies, when his conspirators, his friends, have him killed for being such a bad dictator. The crazy thing is he only got about 4 years of being a dictator before they decided to take him out. The second hub that we want to look at is what deed did Julius Caesar do that maybe he was famous for? And this is one you probably do not know, but he was actually famous for reforming the Roman calendar. He adopted the Egyptian 365-day calendar, and it's actually the calendar that we use today. It's the 365-day calendar, and it's called a solar calendar. Our next bubble. What trait do you think Julius Caesar would have possessed to have made him such a good military conqueror and such a good ruler? Well, bravery, absolutely bravery. You're going to see and read about how in battle Julius Caesar would always put himself in harm's way to accomplish a mission. He was not afraid of much. Who was one of Caesar's enemies? Now, obviously, you probably want to say Brutus was one of his enemies, but who was one of Caesar's other enemies? Pompey, I'm sorry. He was one of his enemies, being that he was one of the conspirators that plotted against him. And who was one of Julius Caesar's friends? Antony. And they had an interesting dynamic. Julius Caesar and Antony actually fall in love with the same woman down the line after Caesar's killed. It's Cleopatra. She was a very fascinating woman. We'll talk about her a little bit, but not a whole lot. So let's go now from our bell ringer and let's talk about growing unrest in Rome. Okay, so here's growing unrest in Rome. And what we're looking at, our question is, what were some of the reasons for unrest in the Roman Republic? We're talking about things are starting to bubble up. People are starting to be more and more on edge because of the way that the state of their Roman Republic has become. So we want to look at what these reasons were. One of our first reasons is the increasing inequality between wealthy landowners and small farmers. So what we have to understand here is that these landed aristocrats, these people who own a lot of land, they put the small farmers out of work. Before Rome was based off of these small farmers, it was the reason why it was successful. Now these small farmers surrender their land or are bought out by the large land barons, these landed aristocrats. And now these small farmers are out of jobs. And what do? They move from the suburban areas out in the country where they can farm, and they end up gravitating towards Rome. And this increases the population of poor, the population of homeless, and obviously when those two things increase, the crime rate goes up. So now there's this unrest between the minority, these smaller farmers, and these wealthy landowners. Our second reason is, like I've touched on, increasing urban population of landless poor. These folks don't have jobs. They move into the Rome city limits, and they're poor. And Rome is just beginning to bubble up. And we've talked about this over and over and over. Anytime your peasant population is not taken care of, there's no jobs, there's no food, there's no money, we get this unrest in society, and this is still true today. And then there's this increasing use of slave labor. These landed aristocrats, these big time landowners and farmers, they were using slave labor. So now you can't even get a job. If you were a farmer and you moved into the city of Rome looking for work and you couldn't find any, well, maybe as a last ditch effort, you can go back to the suburbs to a farm and work for the big time landowners. But now you can't even do that because the slave labor has taken over. Slave labor is cheap. It's free. You can get as much of it as you want as long as you bring slaves in. So those who make more money will continue to make more and more money, and those who don't will continue not to make money. This is always a recipe for disaster, even still today. And lastly, there was a control of government by the wealthy so that the poor had no way to improve their status. This is something that you need to watch out for. Especially in society, once again today, the government is controlled by the wealthy. There's a saying, when 10% of the population control 90% of the wealth. And this is what happens in Rome. And so this creates this instability within the government and a growing unrest that bubbles up within the country. All right, continuing on with the growing unrest in Rome, we're going to look at these guys who tried to fix this. These guys were called the Gracchi brothers. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. They came to believe that the basic cause of Rome's problems was the decline of the small farmer. They wanted to help these landless poor. So what they did is they had the Council of the Plebs pass land reform bills that called for the government to take back these public lands that were held by large landowners and give it back to the landless Romans so that they could have a way of making money. So the two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, they attempted to help small farmers with land reform and give them public land, but they were killed by senators who feared the loss of their land. So going back to our last slide, this is where we talked about that the government was ruled by the wealthy. The wealthy were the landowners. If you put two and two together, you understand that the senators, they own the land. They were the government. They wanted to keep their money. They feared this loss of their land, and so they killed the Gracchus brothers. This is how a lot of things get settled in Rome. Rome is kind of like the Wild Wild West without 6-shooters. People get stabbed, people get killed, people get poisoned all the time. Even these emperors, they're poisoned by their followers, they're poisoned by their loved ones. It's a wild, wild time, but there's a lot that we can take away from the Roman Empire. So what are some of these things that the Gracchi brothers tried to do to help out the Roman Republic when it was in such a state of unrest? Well, Tiberius Gracchus, of course, we talked about land reform, granting of land to landless Romans so that they could have a means of economic income. And they tried to reduce unemployment by getting rid of the slaves on the large farms, getting the smaller farms back in business, and having people actually work and make money on these farms. His brother Gaius, he went through the extension of citizenship to non-Romans, trying to get everyone involved in the affairs of the Roman Empire. Reduction of food prices. If the food prices come down, then obviously people can eat. So we tried to have the food prices reduced, and more legal rights for farmers. Wanted to make sure that these farmers could protect themselves from the bigger landed aristocrats. And obviously, as we spoke about, this doesn't work out too well for them. They're assassinated and one commits suicide. Let's take a look now at this timeline that depicts the martyrs of the Roman Republic. And you have to understand what the word martyr is. It's someone who is killed for their religious beliefs or otherwise. So if you look at the timeline, as we see going up halfway a little bit further as you get into 133 BC, we see that Tiberius Gracchus is elected tribune. He proposes land reforms and then is murdered by a mob in 133 BC. As you move a little bit further, you see his brother Gaius Gracchus. He commits suicide to avoid capture by his political opponents. They're coming for him, and as opposed to be torn limb from limb, he decides to make it swift and easy on himself. You can move a little bit further, and you see that Julius Caesar is assassinated in 44 BC. And then in 27 BC, Octavian Caesar is named Augustus, the first emperor of the Roman Empire. So we're going through this period of, and this just to show how Rome is in a state of unrest, where if people don't like what's happening, as opposed to voting on it and having the people, the actual citizens of the Roman Republic decide what is best, those who are in control, who are at the top, are pulling the strings and making things happen for themselves. Next, let's talk about this new Roman army. So we get this Roman general. His name is Marius. All right. And we want to look at how did the Roman army change as a result of Marius's new methods of recruitment. So let's first understand what the original methods of recruitment were. For a long time, the Roman army had been made of men who were landholders of small farms. Now these generals like Marius recruited volunteers from these urban areas. So if you're a landowner of a small farm, your investment, your interest is more so in your farm and your family than this military and this government that is right now not for you. This government is actually going away from you. So how does Marius change the game? Well, he made up of landless, urban, and rural poor rather than these land-owning small farmers. So even like today, our militaries in America, they recruit people who come from urban and poor areas out in the suburbs. People who really don't have any other means of education or work. And then what they do is they make them loyal to the general rather than to the Roman state. So these guys who are poor and these generals come and find them, they recruit them, they get them to volunteer. They say, you got to be loyal to me. I'm going to take care of you. And here's how I'm going to do this. I'm going to take care of you by making sure that when you're done, you're going to have land, you're going to have a place to stay, you're going to have a means of income. We're going to take care of you under my army, but you're loyal to me, not to the Roman state. And this creates another area of unrest. Generals' involvement in politics to obtain land for their veterans, as in the case of Sulla, who used his army for political ends. So these generals now became involved in politics. They had to convince the Senate to give their veterans land that they were promising them to join up, this land for when they retired. So now these generals become involved in politics, and this is a recipe for disaster, so to speak, because now you've got an army that is loyal to a general who is involved in politics, trying to influence things, and if he doesn't get his way, what do you think he's going to do? Well, he's going to use his army that is loyal to him. All he has to do is turn around and say, hey, the Senate is not giving me what I want. What do you guys want to do? And what do you think they want to do? The country has already turned their backs on them. These landed aristocrats have all the money. That's the reason why they're in the army. Of course, they're going to uprise with this general. And that's exactly what we see later on. Let's talk now about the struggles between Marius and Sulla, these two Roman generals. Marius created a new system of military recruitment, which placed great power in the hands of the general. Sulla was appointed to military command. Now, the council of the plebs tried to transfer Sulla's military to Marius. This didn't work. Sulla did not want to lose the power that he had. These were his troops. They were loyal to him. So when the council of plebs tried to transfer Sulla's power to Marius, a civil war breaks out. Sulla actually wins, though. He seizes Rome. He conducted a reign of terror to destroy opposition. And it's funny they use the term reign of terror. That's another term you're going to hear again. Same term you're going to hear again once we do the French Revolution. And the same thing happens. You try to destroy your opposition. You go out and you seek out who are those who are against me. If you're against me, if you're heard talking out about me, if I think you're against me, I'm going to get rid of you in swift and certain terms. And this creates this terror among the people. And so but he restores power back to the Roman Senate. And he does this hoping to create a firm foundation to restore a traditional Roman republic. But what he does is it actually backfires. Sulla's example shows later generals you can use an army to seize power. So they missed the point. These later generals missed the point. Sulla seizes control. He gives control back to the Senate. But what they see is not the end result of the Senate should have the power. They see the beginning result, the means. Sulla used his army to seize control to begin with. And so this backfires, and other generals will use it later on down the road. All right, so this is a picture of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. These guys got together to form the first triumvirate. So they were military generals. They came to hold enormous military and political power. Crassus became known as the richest man in Rome. Pompey had turned from a successful command in Spain as a military hero, and Julius Caesar also had a military command in Spain. So these guys joined forces, and they decide that they should be the ones that rule Rome. So they are ruling Rome from different areas. Pompey received a command in Spain, Crassus goes to Syria, and Caesar was granted a special military command in Gaul, which is modern-day France. But a couple of things happened. Crassus was killed in battle. Caesar gained more fame and military experience, and he was willing to face great personal danger. And this led to a sense of entitlement when this next thing happens. Pompey and Caesar, they start to struggle for control of Rome. They go from being friends, from ruling together in this triumvirate, and now I guess you could call it a biumvirate, since now that Crassus is killed in battle, and now there's two left. And now they're vying for control. One man alone wants to rule. And here's what happens. The Senate actually says that Pompey is the one who should rule, and that Caesar needs to step down. But of course, Caesar, given the fact that he feels entitled to control of Rome because of all that he's done and putting his life in harm's way, he refuses to step down. And so what he does instead is he marches on Rome with his army. Remember now, his army, these armies are loyal to the generals. So they march on Rome, and he defeats Pompey. And after that, Caesar was officially made dictator, and then dictator for life. So what we talked about before, where we see that the conflict between Marius and Sulla, how using an army to overthrow the government works, we see Caesar use the same technique. Now, what happens is that the power goes to Caesar's head. People begin to resent the growing power and accomplishments that Caesar had come to have. And a group of senators, some of his friends, they assassinate him. They thought that this would return Rome back to a republic, but instead it led to another civil war. This is our dictatorial cycle. Once the dictator is out, there's a power vacuum, and then people are struggling and fighting for control, and it breaks out into civil war. So now out of the first triumvirate, we get the second triumvirate. Again, the cycle starts all over again. So there's this new struggle for power following the death of Caesar, and you get three men: Octavian, who was Caesar's grandnephew and heir to his throne; Antony, who was actually Caesar's ally and his assistant; and Lepidus, who had been commander of Caesar's cavalry. So all three of these guys are connected to Caesar in one way or another. They join forces to make the second triumvirate. So it's Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus. Remember who's in your first and who's in your second triumvirates, please. Lepidus was forced into exile. This division of Roman world between Antony and Octavian soon ensues. So Antony and Octavian, the world is not enough for them. For one of them to rule the East and the other to rule the Western Roman Empire, that's not enough. They want it all. Antony's alliance with Cleopatra VII of Egypt. So Antony, this is where he actually goes and he falls in love with Cleopatra of Egypt. Caesar fell in love with this woman at first as well. Now, at the Battle of Actium in Greece in 31 BC, Octavian's forces were smashed. All right, they were just destroyed, utterly destroyed. And the navy of Antony, they destroyed the army and the navy of Antony and Cleopatra. They both flee to Egypt, and a year later, they both commit suicide. So that leaves Octavian as the sole ruler of Rome. This is the end of the Roman Republic now. There's no return back to a republic now that Octavian is left the sole ruler of Rome. This line of dictators or imperators, emperors, is what we're going to see from here on out. So let's wrap this thing up. Let's land the plane. Chapter 7, Lesson 2, From Republic to Empire, review. First points are this: there was growing unrest in Rome, and an increasing inequality between wealthy landowners and small farmers created some of this unrest. Increasing urban population of landless poor added to the unrest. An increasing use of slave labor added to this unrest. And then we see where civil war ensues. We have our first triumvirate: Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. Please remember who's in the first triumvirate. We have our second triumvirate: Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus. Remember that Lepidus was forced into exile. A division of the Roman world between Antony and Octavian soon ensued after this. Antony's alliance with Cleopatra VII of Egypt made him powerful. It also made him love crazy, and he kills himself with this woman after they lose at the Battle of Actium. So please remember, you have to study for your vocab quiz. Your GRA is due by midnight tonight. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please come see me. If you need paper-based items, please come see me as well. I'm here for you. I'm here to serve you and help you out. God bless you. Have a good day.